Hello National 5 historians, and welcome to lesson 5 in our Hitler and Nazi Germany topic. We are moving on to look at the Weimar Republic. Now that we've talked about the state of Germany at the end of the war, and we've had a chat about the people that tried to organise it, and then the Treaty of Versailles and the Armistice, and we've talked a little bit about the groups that tried to overthrow the Republic as it was being created, we now look at the Republic itself once it has been created. So two things that we're really focusing on with this is the key features of the Weimar Constitution, so what the actual features of it were, and to explain why it encountered problems as a new republic. So again, anywhere you're doing your notes, any place that this is in your jotter hopefully, or in your folder on notepad or on your phone or on a Word document, somewhere you're going to be able to get them really easily accessible because you will need them for your revision. Can you just put the heading the Weimar Republic and move on to the next bit? So at the end of the First World War, Germany obviously knew that the type of government that they had in place was no longer cut it. They needed something different, they needed a new system. They'd been under the control of the Kaiser up to this point, and they were looking for something that was going to be more democratic. This new system that we now know is the Weimar Republic. And it was named that because obviously there was so much turmoil and things happening in Berlin where they had originally met, and the Reichstag members had met, with things like the Spartakists and them fighting with the Freikorps, that they decided that they had to meet someplace a little bit less violent. So they met in the small town of Weimar and the Republic was born. So the group of experts and politicians met after the Kaiser's abdication in Weimar, and they designed what would become known as the Weimar Constitution, a new constitution for the country. Friedrich Ebert, the leader of the Social Democrats, or the SPD, became the very first ever elected president of this new republic, and the government was basically called the Weimar Republic because of the small town that it was established in, which, remember, was a good distance away from where Berlin was, so a good distance away there where they would be nice and safe. The new constitution then that they drew up was split into two parts. Part 1 dealt with Germany's system of government, how it was going to exist as a new government, as a new democracy. Part 2 dealt with the people, so it dealt with civil rights, things that all Germans would actually have, and it was formally introduced in August of 1919. So part 1 of the Weimar Constitution. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the next couple of slides to just take notes about the actual constitution itself and about the government. So can you make sure that you maybe split a page maybe in half, or you take 2 pages and you have some notes about the government part, and then we'll talk about the civil rights part in more detail in a little bit. So the first part of the constitution, like we said, described how Germany's government was going to be run. The country would now be a republic, so they would not have a monarchy, and it meant that people would vote for their government, very similar to what we would maybe have in Britain today, but obviously slightly different. All German people, men and women, who were aged 20 or over, were allowed to vote and to choose members of the Reichstag, which is the national parliament of Germany. People aged 35 and over were then also allowed to vote for the country's president, and that took place every 7 years. So very democratic, way ahead of its time in comparison to some places where women are being given the vote on equal status to men, and allowing people to actually vote for the president as well as the actual party itself. The Reichstag was also given more authority under the Weimar Constitution. It had the power to pass laws and decide how money would be spent as a country. It could remove members from the government, such as the Chancellor and things like that, from their jobs. If they weren't doing their jobs properly, it had that authority as well. The elections, for the Reichstag elections, they used a system called proportional representation, or what we'll refer to as PR, which basically meant that parties got Reichstag members based on the number of votes that they got. So proportional representation meant that smaller parties could also be elected to the Reichstag, and it was trying to create a more democratic government. So someplace where people, no matter how small the party, could actually be heard. It allowed everyone to make a vote, and then that vote turned into a seat. So even smaller parties would get some sort of say in government. It also gave a president. They had the power to appoint members of the government, such as the Chancellor. That was their job, to say this person is now going to be a Chancellor, didn't matter which party they were in. They could dissolve the Reichstag anytime that they needed to and call for new elections. And they also had something called Article 48. Article 48 was designed to pass laws in an emergency situation. So they were able to pass laws without having to consult the rest of the Reichstag and be able to do it just because it was an emergency situation, and then that power defaulted back from them. Now this is going to become really important later on when we're thinking about how Hitler and the Nazis were able to take power, those two things, the proportional representation and Article 48, the president's power. Those two things are going to be really important. So that's the information about part 1. We're now moving on to look at part 2 and thinking about the civil rights that were available in the Weimar Constitution for the German people. So again with this one, just put part 2 as your heading and civil rights, and then we'll look for information from there. So the second part of the Constitution described all of the various rights that were to be given to Germans. These are some of the rights that you can kind of see here, and this is a really good gridding task, so I would really recommend that you try it as a grid. If you're definitely not a grid person, again just do it as a list or do it as a mind map, but you can see the types of rights that are available. So the first right they had was to choose whichever religion they wished to follow. They had the right to their own religions. The second is that no one could be jailed without being given a fair trial. They were given freedom of press, the right to vote by secret ballot, so no one could actually see who they were voting for or intimidate them. No one could be arrested unless they were suspected of breaking the law. Every man or woman over the age of 20 was allowed to vote in the Reichstag elections. That was a right that they had. They had the right to join a political party or to set up their own political party. No one could stop them doing that. They could join a trade union or campaign for better working conditions, and they were allowed to do that. That was a right they had been given. They were given freedom of speech. They were given the right to hold peaceful meetings. They were given the right to secrecy in terms of their correspondence, so letters and phone calls and things like that could not be listened into or could not be opened and read by anybody. They were allowed to have secrecy when that was concerned. And they also built in the right for German people to vote for a new Reichstag every 4 years and for a new president every 7 years. So 4 and 7 became when the elections would be held for the various parts. So draw a grid out, or whatever way you've decided you're taking your notes for this, and make a copy of the rights that Germany got under your heading about part 2, and make sure you've got this describe the rights of the Germans under the Constitution heading, subheading in as well. So again, I'll put up all of these rights that they've been given. Pause the video and make sure you've got a copy of them. Feel free to do little doodles and things beside each one to help you remember it, and then go back to about 9 minutes and sort of 25 seconds for the next task. So basically this new constitution was a massive step forward for the German people. It gave ordinary Germans far more rights than they had ever had under the Kaiser. Germany was actually one of the most democratic governments in the world at this point in time. Even women could vote. It was really very much ahead of its time in terms of political thinking, very democratic. However, 15 years later it had completely collapsed into ruins. The reason for this is that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party had come to power and had turned the country into one of the most brutal dictatorships that the world has ever known. Very much a far cry different from this democratic thing that they were trying to set up. So what you're going to do with these tasks is you're going to pick 4 of the rights that you think would be the first 4 that Hitler would take away from the German people. And you're going to write a sentence in your notes just explaining why you think Hitler changed this particular right. So pick 4 out of the ones that we've looked at that you think Hitler would take away and explain why he does this. It might look something like this. So one right that Hitler changed or took away was choice of political party or being able to join political parties. He changed this because he didn't want competition against the Nazi Party. So pick 4, write it out, pause the video here and then come back at roughly 11 minutes and 15 seconds for the next task. Okay, so new heading then that we're looking at is if all these things were really great and it was giving much more democratic rights to the German people and it looks really good on paper, why ultimately did it fail? Why did it experience problems and what were these problems? So we're looking at the negatives of the Constitution. Okay, learning intention for this one, again, we just want to be able to explain what these problems actually were. So if you think about what the negatives actually were, there's 8 of them in general, and again it's a really good gridding task, but you can do it as notes if you would prefer, and we're just going to look at these in a wee bit in more detail. So major problem number 1, hatred from the public. As we saw in the Treaty of Versailles lesson, the Weimar government did not get off to a good start. They had dealt with violent rebellion in the capital city by the Spartakists, and it meant that they had to flee into Weimar to actually remain safe, which is obviously why it becomes known as the Weimar Republic. And things didn't actually stop there, because in 1923 they also had an uprising from Hitler and the Nazis in the Beer Hall Putsch. Now we've not looked at that in more detail just yet, but you will have seen that happening, Hitler's attempt at taking over, when we watched Rise of Evil, so we will come back to that in a wee bit more detail. In addition to this, there was a lot of uprisings by people who were still loyal to the Kaiser. They didn't want to live in a democracy, they were used to him, they didn't know what to think about this democracy, so they wanted him back, and they sometimes became quite aggressive against the government trying to protest this. Finally, the public are really angry because of the Treaty of Versailles. The terms and the things that imposed on Germany meant they were looking for someone to blame, and they claimed that the government had stabbed them in the back by signing it, and because they had surrendered in the war to the Allies at the Armistice Day, they were the November criminals. So there was a couple of serious things that we've looked at here already that were major problems contributing to hatred from the public for the Weimar government, and these things contributed to the problems that they would face. So for this one, put the heading major problem number 1, hatred from the public, and we're just looking for kind of key points from this. So we could say the Weimar government did not get off to a good start. We've got violent rebellion in the capital by the Spartakists. We've got the Beer Hall Putsch, 1923. Many Germans still loyal to the Kaiser and didn't want democracy. And the public were angry with the Treaty of Versailles and looking for someone to blame. Stabbed them in the back, November criminals. So that's our key points for major problem number 1. So we can break this down into our first 4 boxes in our grid. So public were angry at the Treaty of Versailles, which had been signed, stabbing them in the back. We've got the second bit there, blamed the Weimar government for surrendering because some people believed they could have fought and won. They were November criminals. Some of them loyal to the Kaiser didn't want democracy, and riots going on like the Spartakists and the Beer Hall Putsch. So in your grid or your list that you're making, I would put these bits down. If you've already copied it from the previous slide when we highlighted it, that's absolutely fine. Don't write it again. Just make sure it's really clear that these were the first 4 problems that they were facing. Major problem number 2 is with the new constitution itself. Okay, so a constitution is the rules of a country. In Germany, they were referred to as the fundamental laws. This constitution and these fundamental laws, remember, were brand new to Germany. The politicians didn't have any experience of democratic government at this point in time, and that was a major issue. The president was elected to be head of the country every 7 years, but you had to be over 35 to vote. He was in charge of appointing the head of the armed forces, appointing the chancellor, who was the head of the government and basically ran parliament from day to day. He could veto any legislation, which meant he could say no to anything and put a stop to it, and he could rule in an emergency without approval under Article 48. So that's kind of the constitution and the problems that that includes. So if we break these down into some of our other boxes, we've got these things here. So the German politicians lacked any experience of democracy. It was kind of trial and error to see how they got on and fix it if they could. The main 2 problems with the constitution itself were the veto gave the president far too much power over parliament, and also Article 48, which again gave him too much power in a time of emergency, but still too much power for any one person to hold. And that was going to become really apparent when Hitler does manage to take over the Reichstag. So add these to our grid or our list of information that we're working on. Major problem number 3 is the voting system. The results of the first election kind of went like this. The Socialist Democratic Party got 38%, the Catholic Centre Party got 20%, and the Democratic Party got 18%. So obviously the Socialist Democratic Party would be the ones that would win that election. But in an election when no party gains 50% of the public votes, a coalition is then formed. And this is where the government will be made up of groups of smaller parties rather than one party, which are counted together to then make their 50%. In order to rule in this situation, the SPD formed a coalition with the Democratic Party, which is the first of many coalitions that the Weimar Republic is going to make. Because proportional representation meant that there were so many different littler parties that got the vote, it was the only way to actually get a majority, was to form a coalition with another group. We know that Ebert was the first president that was elected, and the problem with these coalition governments were that they ended up being made up of parties that had really different ideals, and what they actually found difficult was to find compromise on policies. They didn't agree on what should become law, they didn't agree on the things that they should do, and generally speaking it meant things were really difficult. They blocked one another from doing anything really important to actually help move Germany on, and that became more and more of an issue when the people of Germany started to get more and more annoyed, and again led to things like the extremist groups who were able to promise really quite concise things, as they could promise these things because they didn't have a coalition to contend with, more popular, and people started to turn towards them. Other problems with the voting system is that during the elections they used this proportional representation. In this sort of thing, you vote for a party, not a person. So that's what we do here. So two different types of ballot paper exist below. So the SPD received 38% of the vote in the first election, so they receive 38% of the seats. This is seen as a fairer system and allows small parties to gain seats. That's pretty much what they do. Okay, you vote for the party, not the person. If you think about why that would be a problem in the future, from what we know is going to happen, this means that when Hitler and the Nazi Party start to become more popular, they don't actually need to have a mass majority of people. They don't actually have to have everyone loving Hitler or the sort of that individual person, as long as they mostly agree with what the party are actually trying to do. So if they vote for the party and they get a vote, they will then get a seat, and they can build that up from there. All very legal and all very damaging every time that they actually do manage to get more and more seats in the Reichstag, which again we saw in Rise of Evil. So our last box on this part about the proportional representation, we've got leading two weak coalitions who found it difficult to agree. Ultimately, this resulted in 21 early elections being held because the government couldn't agree and it came to a standstill, and the president had to dissolve it in order to actually get anything done. And it allowed small extremist parties to gain representation in the Reichstag later on, i.e. the Nazis. So make sure you write this down in your notes that we're taking about this, about the problems, and then move on. So other problems that they had came in the form of political opposition. The first 5 years of the Republic saw rioting, striking, shootings, attempts to overthrow the coalition. The Spartakists had obviously been dealt with, but there were other people that rose up to challenge Ebert's authority. In particular, in March of 1920, a man named Wolfgang Kapp tried his own uprising, known as the Kapp Putsch. He was a right-wing journalist who opposed pretty much all that he believed Ebert stood for, especially after what he saw as a humiliation at the Treaty of Versailles, like many German people at this point in time, and he pretty much staged a similar rebellion to the Spartakists. And Ebert was really very worried about this and thought he would have to use the Freikorps again to stop them, as he had with the Spartakists, but unfortunately he wasn't able to do that because this time the Freikorps were actually the ones that were rebelling. They were rebelling against what they saw as communism and against the chaos that was happening in Germany, and there was no one for Ebert to actually use to put a stop to this rebellion. So it came really close to actually managing to overthrow the government at this point. What actually happened with this was, on the 13th of March 1920, 5,000 Freikorps took over Berlin, and the Berlin police were dispatched to actually deal with it, and instead they joined in the rebellion on the Freikorps and Kapp's side. The Weimar Republic and the government people themselves were actually forced to flee, and the revolutionaries declared that Kapp was the new chancellor and that they had won. And that seemed to be it. But ultimately, the putsch actually did fail. And this is because the workers of Berlin, where the revolution was taking place, refused to accept it, and they went on strike. The whole of the city of Berlin was brought to a total standstill. There was no water, no gas, no coal, no trains or buses, nothing. And it really, really clearly showed that the people of Germany didn't actually support Wolfgang Kapp as much as he thought they did, despite his hatred of the Treaty of Versailles and their hatred of the Treaty of Versailles being the same thing. And he was forced to then flee to Sweden, and that more or less ended his hostile takeover bid. It was a very narrow escape from the government. They literally got away with that by sheer dumb luck, but it was an escape and they did manage to continue. Other problems that they were kind of blamed for as well during this kind of period in time was the reparation payments, when the workers at the Ruhr area refused to give money over to France when they invaded after they missed one, which we're going to come back to. It led to the hyperinflation crisis. Pretty much all they did was print money in order to cover the kind of cost of these workers not working. And the more money they printed, the more worthless it became, until it starts to meet with rising costs, and this becomes really ridiculous. The Wall Street crash then happened in the USA, and the US unfortunately had to call back all of the loans and things that they had given, including the ones that they had given to Germany to try and help support the economy, but we will come back to talk about this. It is just important we note that these were financial problems and issues that the government also had. So, was the Weimar Constitution a real democracy, ultimately? The Weimar system of government was very different from life under the Kaiser. Some people said it was a genuine democracy at the time, other people disagreed. Either way, there was a lot of freedoms, certainly, and a lot of positive things, but a lot of negatives and a lot of problems that the Constitution and then, therefore, the government had to contend with. Reasons we can say it was a democracy, and again, you could split your page for yes and no here. All Germans were given an equal vote. The Reichstag and the President were both elected. Small parties got elected, which meant more voices and more people could therefore be heard, and various rights were guaranteed by law. Reasons it's not a democracy: the voting rights were not completely equal. So, for example, you couldn't vote for the President unless you were over 35. The government were the ones that the government were then therefore appointed by the President. They were not elected by the people. So this meant it wasn't fully democratic, and the President were allowed to pass laws without the Reichstag in support if it was in their mind an emergency. So again, not completely democratic as it possibly could be. Another problem with the system was that by using proportional representation for the elections, it meant that no one ever won a complete majority. Always it was coalitions. They often fell apart quite quickly because they couldn't agree, and a lot of Germans became quite frustrated by this, which showed it wasn't a full democracy where everybody had a say and was listened to. This ultimately made it much easier, as we've said, for these smaller parties to get elected, and get elected in a democratic way, but also for the extremist parties to be more represented in the Reichstag when the kind of things were going badly and they got more votes. This meant that groups like the Nazis, with only a very small support, could start to build a big national profile until eventually they became the leading party. Many Germans did not trust this new democratic system. Some of them blamed the Weimar Republic for the war and signing the treaty. Others wanted the Kaiser back, while other people didn't think that they were actually being given enough of a say. So the mixed reactions from the German people, though it did give them rights and it did give them more access to equality in terms of political campaigning, it wasn't something all of them actually really wanted. And really, the Weimar Constitution was more or less doomed from its own onset. It had given people a democracy that they weren't prepared for, and it had built into it what was supposed to be fail-safe devices to allow the government to be more democratic, which only gave people like the Nazis and Hitler more of a chance to actually get power legally by going through the legal means because of the way that the Constitution was built. So that's the end of the lesson on this. Make sure that you have the notes that we've been taking as we've kind of been going through for this one, and complete any assignment tasks that go with this one in your team on the assignment tab or via email if that is easier for you to submit. You'll see them there, and any questions, make sure you ask your teacher or put a message on the team or email.